Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Dan Schrag. I'm delighted that you're here joining me for this discussion with Claudio Cambon. Claudio is a spectacular photographer. I'm proud to have known Claudio for almost 40 years. If you had come here just a few years ago, in the back hallway, you would have seen Claudio's spectacular photographs documenting shipbreaking in Chittagong in Bangladesh. Claudio, in some ways, was one of your first real engagements with South Asia. The first. Boarded a ship in the United States on its final voyage through to when it ran aground in Chittagong, where they literally tear the ships apart by hand to recycle the steel, and then stayed in Chittagong as they literally tore the entire ship apart. And his documentation of that process is really incredible in capturing the human element as well as the big picture of what was going on. He has an incredible aesthetic eye, but also a very sensitive eye for people. Fast forward to this new exhibit that we're fortunate to have some of the photographs outside. Stepwells, as you may have read in the little piece that Claudio and I wrote together, it's really stepwells are interesting not just because of their history, but because of their future. These stepwells are a reminder of the importance of water in the past, but also as places where people can take refuge from the heat. And heat is something that is a very big deal in India in the years ahead. So what we're going to do is we're going to hear from Claudio. He's going to talk for a little while, and then we'll have a conversation with him, and there'll be a nice reception afterwards. So Claudio, well, I'm glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be back here at the Center for the Environment, the Salat Institute. This has been a lovely association that's taken the form of exhibits and then also photographing many of the fellows over the years, which I called photographic speed dating with the 200 or so fellows. It was a really lovely experience. So I'm very grateful to you, Dan. It's the reason why a lot of this has happened. And to everybody at the Center for the Environment Salat Institute, specifically Dr. Jim Clem and Laura Hanrahan, who helped make all of this happen. Carlin Carr and everybody at the Mittal Institute for South Asian Studies. And Eric Luden of Digital Silver Imaging, I hope he's here. The digital silver imaging made the prints and the frames and did such a beautiful job. And my friend Carl Mastandrea oversaw the whole process. So I'm very, very grateful to all of you for making that happen, because I don't live locally. And then also to all of you for being here. There's many familiar faces, many friends, some of whom I haven't seen in a long time. So this is really special. Okay, so let me just get this up. What is a stepwell? I mean, for some of you, you may already be well familiar with that, but because people outside the subcontinent generally are not very familiar with them, I'm going to begin with a somewhat elementary description of them. In most parts of the world, a well is a shaft that's sunk into the ground that we use to get water out of it. It's sort of like a straw we sink in down into this mysterious resource that collects this substance that we need to live. And in the subcontinent instead, a stepwell, as its English name implies, has a series of steps that go down into the ground and that lead you to the water's edge. And this makes it more than a conduit. It becomes an inhabitable space, something that you can occupy, that you can be in. And so it's a totally different experience of the below ground and of water as a whole. And because no two of them are alike, I was pretty fascinated with the first one that I saw, but after that, one of the things that fueled this project was the endless diversity of these structures. They range from one simple flight of steps into a square tank to 9 stories below ground. They can be simple and austere, or incredibly ornate and elaborate. Again, no two of them are alike. And they are all over the country, everything from in the middle of the countryside to dense urban settings. They've served many different kinds of settlements, even as the nature of those settlements has changed. They're part of a larger corpus of water architecture, which is very specialized in India, because this is a country that gets all of its rainfall basically in 2 to 3 months in the year, and then for especially the semi-arid areas of the country, has to work at controlling, channeling, and storing the water for communities to be able to survive and thrive. So these include what we call step ponds or tanks, and more loosely river ghats. You think of images of Varanasi, these steps that go down to the water. It's in terms of typologies, it's maybe a little bit hard to draw a distinction in certain instances between what is one thing and one thing is another. I visually drew it at the fact I considered a well to be, let's say, deeper than it was wide. And again, these were essential for the growth of civilization in India. In many cases, we know that the well was the first structure to be built in the settlement, and because without that, people were not sure whether it was feasible to be there. So, and actually, just as an aside, these are unique to the subcontinent. Really, you do see them elsewhere in the world, but only as an exception, as a folly. And there's something very particular about this vision of steps to water that Indians have. And again, when you think of Varanasi, you think of all these steps going down right into the water, actually. And it's not something that we do in other places in the world. Although this morning I was thinking about, for those of you who have ever walked out of the train station in Venice, and there's just that beautiful long, wide staircase that kind of takes you down towards the Grand Canal. And that is somewhat the sensation that ghats give, and this, in general, taking steps down to the edge of the water. It's a very particular invention that Indians have developed over the centuries, and I think is very, very lovely. As to how old are step wells, the oldest ones, or fragments of ones, that have been incorporated into structures that have been updated are in western Gujarat and around a town called Junagadh, and we think that those pieces are from the first 500 years of the Common Era, so that a lot of these things are as much as 1,500 years old, if not older, of the ones that are uncovered, because some of them have been filled in over time. The peak building period is probably, and I'm winging it a little bit, probably from the 10th to the 17th centuries. And by the time the British colonized India, that had largely petered out. I mean, these things were built very stoutly and to last. So at a certain point, they had more or less created the infrastructure they needed. And then, of course, there was the rise of pipe plumbing, and then eventually indoor plumbing. And the British, like many other foreigners who came to India, didn't trust the wells. They thought that the water was stagnant in the wells, which it's not, because first of all, it's seeped through the ground, through the water table, and then through the rock and gotten in there. But already, for example, Emperor Babur, the first Mughal emperor, in the Baburnama, he talks about they drove him crazy. He wanted fountains. He wanted to see water moving. And the idea that the water was somehow just sort of static, and worse yet, had a few leaves on the top, it drove a lot of people nuts. There still are some wells being built in Karnataka, for example, very simple wells. And a lot of the know-how has simply gone lost. There used to be two communities, one that dug wells through rock and one that dug through soil. The ones that dug through rock, their skills and know-how were absorbed into other trades as the demand fell for wells. But there are still soil diggers. And I know an architect in Bangalore, Vishwanath Shrikantaya, who's a big expert on water. And he's in touch with this community and has worked a lot with the community. And they still have, he went out with them one day and they were digging and they were saying, okay, look, this is good news. Meter down, we're already finding this kind of a stone. That means that the water's here. Just last week I saw this rock instead, so we had to stop. So there are bits and fragments of this culture that are still left, even though the wells are largely, in the past. How many wells are there in India? Hard to know. There's a website called Stepwells.org, which is actually a wonderful resource. This English biologist who lived in Mumbai for 5 years spent every waking moment of his free time. Actually, I have this theory he wasn't even working, because I don't know how he went and saw so many of them. He cataloged about almost 3,000 of them in India, and it's reasonable to assume there's another 1,000 that just haven't been, found and pinned for the website, and happened to me numerous times, that being in a village, and they said, "Oh, it's too bad that if you like this well, there's another well over there, but we filled it in," and so which is probably not bad for the well, as long as they don't build on top of it. So there's a lot of them, okay, now where are they? Let's see here. They are okay. This is actually a screenshot from the stepwells.org page. It just shows you some of the pins. If you were to zoom in, you would see that there's thousands more, because it looks like there's only about 200 of them. But it does give an idea of where they are. So Gujarat, let's see. So Gujarat, and then up into the desert areas in the northern plains, and then this whole area of land, which is more or less the Deccan Plateau. And then you notice that the more east you go, then there's less and less and almost nothing. And that's because you've got different soil, water, and weather conditions. I don't know too much about the specifics of it, and sitting next to my geologist friend, I'm not going to say much more. But it's a little bit harder to dig the wells there, and they have more water. So you've got a surface water culture, and that's where you see like the large, broad ponds that are commonly called tanks in India. And then certainly when you get to Bangladesh, there the name of the game is to sort of keep the water away, because they have so much of it in most of the country. So again, you find them everywhere in all kinds of settings, and there's more in Pakistan than what's on in the map. But really, elsewhere in the world, there's just here and there. The main one that I think of is, for those of you who've been to Orvieto, there's a beautiful double helical well there. But it was built as a grand civil public works project to protect the Pope, in case the Pope was in residence in Orvieto, was a papal city, and what if they were besieged, because they would just go down off the bluff to the river to get their water. And so they bored this beautiful well by Antonio de Sangallo, who was a great Renaissance architect. But again, it was sort of a one-off. It's not a practice. Now, what do the wells look like? And I may surprise you. I'm going to start actually not with my photographs, but I'm going to start with drawings. This drawing was made for the book that I published by Tanvi Jain, who's a very talented architect. And when I saw her drawings, I knew that I had to include them for two reasons. One, because she draws like the Dickens. Two, because I finally realized that the X-ray-like quality of an architectural drawing here in cross-section gives you a much better sense of what the volume of these structures is, and that could be even more so than if you were standing at the lip looking down into them. And it's not exactly what I was interested in doing in my photographs. I was sort of zoomed in on aspects of the ambiances rather than wanting to show what the mathematical whole was. But this gives you a little bit better sense of it. So this is one type. This is called a kund, and it's characterized by the steps being sort of lateral in the walls. And then you can see on the sides there that the platforms move in, and you get this basically inverted pyramidal shape. And then the well shaft goes down from that, however many meters that it needs to. And then here it is in plan. So of course you're probably thinking M.C. Escher when you see this, and that was certainly my first thought. This is what it looked like, an example of one. This is the first well I ever saw. This is Panamina Kund, which is in the beautiful little town of Amer, north of Jaipur. This is 17th century well. I don't remember exactly now, but they're absolutely mesmerizing. Kunds tend to be associated with temples, and of the various types, people spend more time in other types of wells, which I'll get to in just a second. Okay, this one I actually don't have a drawing for it. These are pretty self-explanatory. This is a helical well. It's a rare type, but certainly a striking one. In Gujarati, it's called a bamaria, which refers to bamra, to a bumblebee, the idea that these bees will fly in a helical pattern. This is a Mughal-era well from the early 16th century in Champaner outside Baroda. And these volumes are obviously more unified. They're easier to appreciate. Okay, now this is the most common type of well. In Gujarati, this is called a vav. When people in Hindi talk about a bauli, they're talking about all kinds of wells, but they tend to be referring to this, which is a linear structure where you can see you start on the left there, and then you walk down. Now this one has what my colleague Harsh Bhavsar, with whom an architect and curator in Ahmedabad, with whom I started this project, he calls it a temple invasion, but this is a very common appropriation of the well. So they'll build a temple on the first landing, and then people will come down and offer devotion here, and they may look at the well, but they tend not to go down into it. And then it kind of continues down, and each platform you get another set of braces on top, and then this one has two wells. And technically, this is here you start to see what you could call the Bamrao pattern, the Bamaria pattern here. So this is even technically a hybrid. This is called Ashapura Mata Nivav, and it is in Bapunagar in Ahmedabad, and it's a big, beautiful well. And it's, as you can see, the point of having so many steps is that because you have this intense period of rainfall, you get sort of a surge in the water table starting July, August, September, and the well fills up. And so it's, in September you may only have to come down to about, let's say, right here. There's a secondary issue, which is that in a city like Ahmedabad, where they're digging so many deep wells, that depresses the water table, and so some of these wells don't really hold much water anymore. But when they were built, let's say the water may be filled all the way, and then as the year wears on and the water table drops, and as people draw more water to the well, this sort of level kind of drops a bit more, and you just walk down to the next landing, and you go down farther and farther and farther, until maybe it could be that at the end of the dry season, which is we're coming up on now, April, May, that you maybe have to go all the way here and even walk down to get to the last of it. So, and so another reason for using the drawings is even I was thinking about this. There's a certain measure of cultural familiarity again that comes into play here, because I was, in thinking about this issue, I was looking at whatever building was right in front of me, and I said, oh, well, why do I perceive the volume of this? When I looked at it, I realized I was only seeing two sides of the six sides of the cube, but we have formed a composite notion in our heads of what a building is above ground, so we just naturally synthesize that based on this composite of images. But with Stepwells, we don't do that, and so the drawings let you do that a little bit better. All right. This is an example of a kund in western Saurashtra called Dandalpur, and you can kind of see the next layer down towards the back. This is probably about a 3, maybe a 4-story well, 14th century, and a little bit wind worn, but structurally actually in pretty good shape. This is instead looking more towards the bottom, up, out the well. So looking out towards the top. So the water in this case would be behind me. This is a 16th century well. I mean, I think also because of all of the bracing, these structures are actually really remarkably stable. When they're not, it's very often because there used to be a lot of space around the wells, and with the rampant urban development in India, now people build right up next to a well, and that downward force probably then ends up pushing inwards on the well, and the fact that it no longer has its habitual cycle of water filling and emptying, that's probably also stressing it out, and that's when you start to see the braces buckling and whatnot. So again, stepwells are everywhere when you know to look for them. But in many people's eyes, they're kind of nowhere, because as people have moved to indoor plumbing, people don't really go into them anymore, and therefore don't think about them. And there's a simple optical reason to it, which is you can be 150 meters, let's say, away from a well and not know it's there, because unless it has above ground markers, it's just a hole in the ground. So how are you going to see it? And this adds to the thrilling sense of discovery, because you have to come really right up to the lip to see what you're dealing with each time. And again, as I mentioned, they're all different. And so you never know what you're going to find. What shape is it going to be in? Is it going to be intact? What's the water level? Have they turned it into a sort of a waste dump, or is it collapsed? Or is there a cobra sitting on step number 3 looking at you, in which case you don't go in? And that's also, again, this was part of the thing that kept me going and wanting to see more and more and more of them. This is another example of the similar structure and a similar view, except this well is slightly fuller. So the burning question, the two things would happen. I'd come to the edge of the well, and I would very often be wowed. And then the second question was, why did they go through so much effort to make a well? Why? Because there are obviously simple cylindrical shaft wells in India. It's not like people don't make them there. But these things are so complex and ornate. And then you find out that sometimes the well was built with stone that came from 60 kilometers away, and there's not a decipherable riverway that was nearby, so it came on a cart or something, not on a boat. So there's a number of reasons for that that are not immediately apparent. This is Adalaj. This is north of Gujarat, which is every Gujarati school child gets to see this once in their lives, and it's one of the loveliest wells to go to because so many of them are empty, which can be lovely and contemplative, and can also be kind of desolate. And this well is just filled with the noise of school children running up and down the steps. So the first thing is that you could call it a notion of overbuild. As I mentioned, these structures were very often the first things that were built in a community, and there was a different sense of the time frame for which they were building. So they wanted it to last the same way we think of, Gothic cathedrals. They didn't build them to last 100 years. They wanted them to last for centuries. So that's some of what's at work. But it's not everything. And the main thing is that these wells are more than just functional spaces. People are not just using them to get water. They are also going into them for social reasons. As I mentioned, as the dry season comes on and the water level goes down, humans can spend more time in the well, and that's actually coincides with the fact that it's getting hotter and hotter outside. So what you're seeing here, for example, is these are backrests, and there's seats, benches where you could sit. And so the idea was that you would go and get water, but you'd also just kind of go and hang out there. It was a public space. We can trace some of the old trade routes that come up from the Arabian Sea across Gujarat and then onto the Deccan Plateau by the lines that you can see of stepwells. Because if you were a merchant with beasts of burden and you had to carry stuff, it was nice to know that you could stop every so and so many kilometers and water your animals. And they were kind of a caravanserai, so people could stay in them too. And then lastly, they are also where these are spiritual places. These are places where people conducted rituals. And this is one of the things that's most fascinating about them to me is the bundling of all these functions. I mean, to us, this would be like saying, imagine you go to a laundromat. It's the most beautiful thing. And guess what? You attend a religious service too. It's not really always a part of how we think about things. But this is something I think is uniquely Indian. I mean, it's a little bit of a cliche to say that, India is a more spiritual country than other places, which is not true. But what is true is the way in which it's integrated into practical daily life in many places where it is no longer the case in our lives, at least as far as I see it. Now, and this well, I'll get back to this. This well was built by a woman. She was the manager of Sultan Mahmud Begara's harem, and with her retirement package, she decided to build a well. And I'll get back to why this is interesting, because she's not the only person to have done this. So we have all these various functions. Not many of them are left. I probably saw about 250 wells or so, and I only ever saw people actively using a well 3 or 4 of those times, and generally in a rural setting. Other times you could see wells where they were next to a field and people were pumping the water out. But again, they're largely left alone, but they're in a wonderful way, they're still there. The rituals have largely gone lost. I have a suspicion that in the South, I've seen that there's many more water festivals that happen around water structures. There may be greater continuity of ritual there. But you do see, it's lovely, you'll see, let's say, a young couple going down into a well together, and it's reasonable to assume that they're going to ask for fertility blessing. So their traditions do survive in a very general sense, but the more codified, elaborated things, that's gone lost. So what are we left with? What we're left with is the sense of the aesthetic. This is how we are able to access the wells, are able to appreciate them. And this is, of course, was an important part of the wells. This is one of my favorites. This is as if Tadao Ando had gone back into the 16th century and designed a well. Just as in any religious structure, the point of making them beautiful is it's not incidental. It's to lead you through the structure to contemplate the water and its immanence, what it means. In other words, you're there to get water, and you're there to think about what water means to you, in terms of your biological survival, but in terms of your own existence. And in fact, there's one of the many words for water in Sanskrit. Jivana means water and life. And for Hindu devotees, there's a process called darshan, which is when you see the divinity and the divinity sees you, and that's the kind of moment of blessing or enlightenment, benediction. And this generally takes statuary form if you go to a shrine or there's a festival, but it doesn't have to be anthropomorphic. So, for example, for any of you who have been to Guwahati in Assam, there's a temple called Kamakya, and there's the goddess is basically you go down into this impossible stairwell, and it's crowded, and then there's a point, there's a spring on a hill, which is why it's always been, people venerated there for millennia, and there's a rock and there's water, the spring is coming over the rock, and that's the goddess. But that's your darshan, is looking at the water. So the part of the point of these wells is that it's just for you to sort of be in the well, and the wells want you to stay in there and to think about what you're seeing and to enjoy it. And it's really one of the lovely things about them. Now, sometimes the form of the well itself will embody this spiritual devotional aspect. Now, it could be in emulating other sacred architectures. So what you see here, these tower-like structures, these are called shikaras, which are the temples, the sort of towers on most Hindu temples. It can be the embodiment of a ritual form. I may be wrong, but I've always thought that the shape of this water body is like a dais on which you sometimes see a Hindu divinity sit. And then this one, this is just sort of is so out there, or it mirrors your direct sort of sense of what you think the cosmos is. This one looks like a spiral galaxy to me. There's a lovely thesis that I'm finally getting my hands on that was written at Sept by a man named Kartik Vora. And he talks about how, he says, the wells, he says, you don't know whether it's an implosion or an explosion. And I thought there was a lovely way to think about it, and this well sort of typifies that. And then the wells can even emulate ritual forms of the body. This is the shape that we think of as being the diya, which is the little votive lamp that you put at a temple, or the yoni, which is the symbol of the female organ. If you go to a Shiva temple and you see the lingam, the cylinder, which is sort of is priapic form, and then it sits in this sort of a structure. So in this one, it's very much saying something about the divine and the sacred, and specifically about its feminine nature. The underground and water are feminine and female in most cultures. Most agricultural divinities are women, for example. And so it's not a stretch to say that the wells are female spaces, and this one obviously makes that case more than all of them. And again, the wells were built for women because they were the ones mostly getting the water. And in this case, it's about women, you could say. And as I was mentioning earlier, the wells were also very much by women. India's most famous well was built by a queen in honor of her husband, Rani Ki Vav, which is on the back of the 10 rupee note. I mean, and the one that I mentioned earlier, Dala Harir. That too. Many of them have builders' plaques that indicate this fact. And I think that's a fascinating aspect of their history. There's a lovely book by Purnima Bhatt called Her Space, Her Story that talks about this. So this is a well called Shakti Kund, Shakti being the sort of divine female essence. And although it's not in the frame, most of the statues of the deities that you see in the niches are of women, and there's one to the right of the frame, and it's of a woman giving birth, as in she's squatting, and there's a baby's head coming out from between her legs, which is not an image you see in most temples. And this is at Adalaj. This is a wedding dance. This is called Garba. And there's a tourist entrance, and everybody comes in, and there's a Saturday morning, and there's a wedding party, and they just banged on the locals' gate on the other side, and the chowkidar went over and opened the gate, and they came in, and they just totally took over the well. It was just lovely. So I didn't. Catching people in the wells was a little bit of a numbers game because as I said, they're largely not occupied, and very often it was kids that were curious and they would come down and follow us around. So it was a little bit happenstance. There's a well in Karnataka, which is I think it's 13th century. It's called Musakina Vibavi, and this one was used by farmers in the fields. They would lower pumps into it, and as you can see, it was also the village swimming pool. So like I said, it's just a numbers game. You just have to go enough of them, and finally you catch people in them. So, in general, just wanted to end by describing some of the reasons why I undertook this project, other than obviously a fascination with the structures for how beautiful and varied they are. But a lot of it began with my fascination with water as a kid. I was just in Maine visiting my mom, and the water table there has never been stable. And the first well that she and my dad had drilled drew 70 gallons a day, which is nothing. Right? And so then when they wanted to dig a second well, they had a dowser come. And so old Mr. Dodge came, and he had this kind of wishbone-shaped piece of ash, and he walked around with the two ends of the wishbone like this, and he came over to the spot, and it just flipped over, right? And, my parents, my brother and me were like, yeah, right. And he was used to this, I guess. He goes, you don't believe me, do you? And he goes, here, you can try it. And so I went and I tried to do it. I put my hands beneath his, and we got to the spot, and I didn't feel it. But my brother felt it. And afterwards, we talked about it a few years later, and he said it was like losing an arm wrestling match that's over before you knew it. He said they were walking around, they got to the spot, and the stick just went down. And sure enough, we sank a well there, and there was water there. And so I was all fascinated my whole life. So how do they know it was there? What is that water? What is it in? What is that dimension? And the fact is that the wells spatialize this for you in a rational manner, and they give you a sort of abstract sense of what that could be. I thought that was pretty fascinating. Also, in terms of going down steps, I hated the cellar as a kid. I was claustrophobic. I just didn't like these big, dark, empty spaces. I live in Paris. I take the subway. It's great, but I think it's only because I know I'm going to pop up out somewhere else that I can stand it. I felt really cut off from everything else, and because these are exposed to the rest of the world. Oh yeah, there's actually one more of Tanvi's drawings. This is of this well that I just showed you the picture. This is also a helical well, but a more complicated one, with a million monkeys in the tree. But in the stepwells, instead, you always see the sky. You can hear the noise that's of what's happening on the surface, and this sense of continuity between what Mircea Eliade calls the different planes of our existence is really striking. And it's when you go down into a well, you instantly feel everything changing visually. The sense of the temperature is changing, acoustically, sound changes, the smell changes, and it leads you and puts you in this very contemplative frame of mind. I don't really know how to say it. It's really a tremendous experience, and I think it's unique as as far as underground experiences go, because we can't say the same thing about going down into a parking garage, for example. It doesn't produce that same sense of epiphany. And this is the last one. This is also just this lovely sense of kind of being slightly removed from the world, but at the same time being very connected to it. So,
thank you, Claudio.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I think we're just going to open it up to questions for Claudio for clarification. I would say there is one professor of architectural history in the room, and I thought we might turn to him first for questions, since Max Page is visiting from the University of Massachusetts.
I actually did have a question, Claudio. I know Claudio 40 years ago. Because you mentioned Ando, like you made sort of a passing comment. I don't know actually. Is there direct influence? Are current either architects from around the world or in India specifically referred to these? Because I was going to say Louis Kahn as well. I mean, there's who, of course, designed architect. I mean, built some important buildings in India and Bangladesh.
Well, the architect that comes to mind is Charles Correa, who incorporated stepwell motifs into a lot of his buildings. So there's a direct quotation in a way of what wells are. Did Tadao Endo ever see that well? I'm not sure, but it's very much in the spirit of these kind of concrete cylinders. I'm not really well versed enough to know who else would have drawn from them.
I even think of buildings at the British Art Center at Yale or the Yale Art Gallery with those cylindrical staircases.
That's true, actually, because Louis Kahn built the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad, and so it's very likely that he saw wells. So, and he was a great eclectic spirit, so I'm sure he absorbed what he saw.
Please.
Yeah. I am Abhishek Jain. I am an officer from the Indian Administrative Service, the premier civil service in India, and presently serving as the finance secretary of my province. Just like to add, I am very fascinated and impressed by the photography and all the history. Just like to add on a few things just related to this, and I'll be very brief. First is I could not see many stepwells kind of structures in the Himalayan region, and I am serving for the last more than 2 decades as a senior officer in Himachal Pradesh. And personally, I have been working on the conservation and preservation of all these traditional structures. Of course, because of the hilly regions, they are smaller in size. They are called Kool, Khatri, Baudi, and they are used not only for the drinking water purposes, but for irrigation purposes also. And I will also highlight, I just published around 15 years back one paper, how with the community support, we rejuvenated almost 700 of traditional drinking water sources, which even now, though we have tapped water almost 100%, but despite that, the importance of all these structures, whether big or small, whether for drinking water or for irrigation, that remains, especially in the rural areas, especially in the hilly areas, Himalaya area. And I would be happy to share those things, but they are required to be present. So my point is that despite all the people having drinking water and other water through the tap, these structures are still preserved, and they are considered vital for the village economy, for drinking. And I have been a part of, we spent almost somewhere around 20 million rupees for the conservation of around 700 of such sources. And you could see the water in these was even better than the mineral water bottle. Yeah, because that is coming and it contains a lot of minerals which are not there in the mineral water bottle. So I would say that we need these kind of structures, the preservation, and there is a variety of these kind of sources. Most of them which you have shown are in the plain areas of India, but I just want to say that, and I can share the photographs and my paper also, that many of the Himalayan portions of India as well as the adjoining areas also have these kind of structures in different names, smaller in size, and used both for drinking and irrigation purposes. And I feel that we need to preserve them. And the community is also coming because they are seeing the effects of the climate and how much effort and electricity it goes in pumping the water from the river to provide to the people sitting at the top of some hills. And there, these kind of structures or the khatri and body are quite critical.
Yeah, that's fascinating. In fact, in the city of Bangalore, Vishwanath Shrikantaya, whom I was mentioning, was instrumental in helping draft the city's water policy, which mandates that new constructions have to have what they call recharge wells. So they have to dig a small, shallow well 3 to 6 meters deep to catch rainwater. All the roofs will gutter into them because Bangalore almost ran out of water the other summer, and Chennai a few years before that also did, because for the longest time people said, oh, just dig a deeper well, and it's not working. It's just depressing the water table to the point of unfeasibility. And people are slowly coming around to realizing, well, it's been all about catchment all along, and if you cement over every square inch of your city, you don't have any absorption, and you just let the rainwater go, you're not helping yourself either. And so there's this lovely movement on all fronts to get back to that.
And just to add to what you said, because of the preservation of what we did in one district in Himachal Pradesh, Hamirpur district, where I was the commissioner, we rejuvenated, which were not used, but within 1 year, all of them were rejuvenated in the traditional sense, around 700 of them. And because of that, the water level in the entire district rose by more than 2 feet.
Yeah, amazing.
So the impact of these is not just localized, but it is across the board.
Yeah, fascinating.
Other questions for Claudio? Please.
Yes.
I was just read that they had built a tsunami tower in the Pacific Northwest that would protect 400 people if there was a tsunami that's supposed to happen in the next 100 years. And in thinking of these wells, is there any talk about their use as protection when the wet bulb temperature becomes terminal in the future for communities as a place to save 400 people in a community from dying?
Well, this is something that Dan is starting to work on, that, as I mentioned, this coincidence of the wells, the water level going down and becoming inhabitable right as the temperatures are getting hotter and hotter. Yeah, this is becoming a matter of interest to people because because it works. It's simple. It's energy passive once you build it. So
I would say that the importance of these wells is not necessarily directly as shelters. You could shelter some people, but the numbers of people you have to shelter are so great that they're not a broad strategy per se. I think of them more as a cultural demonstration that such efforts to imagine underground refugia, underground shelters for a very large population for extreme heat events in India's future, in some ways there's a cultural resonance and therefore a cultural demonstration that it's possible, that India could undertake a massive effort to create, and it would be done building by building, basement by basement. Now I will say that in the short term there's going to be a lot of air conditioners installed in India too. 10% of homes in India currently are air conditioned, and that's going to change in the next 20 years. And there are big challenges with that in terms of technology, the efficiency of the air conditioners, how they're used, etc. But this should be part of the conversation. And to me, these stepwells are very symbolic of how there's a deep cultural resonance for this kind of an approach.
And I think the saving 400 people in the Pacific Northwest is a symbol to it's not the answer.
Yeah.
It's the symbol that you're talking about, that people need to think about being ready for earthquakes.
Exactly. And I will say that in this big workshop that Peter Hybers, who just was here but left, Peter Hybers and I and Sachin Balsari and others have organized a 4-day workshop in India with the Mittal Institute on heat, looking at extreme heat, both from a climate perspective, from a health perspective, from a work perspective, and also from a agricultural perspective, and also from a sort of built environment perspective. And Alan Garber, president of Harvard, is going to be in Delhi, and on the first day there will be a plenary with Alan Garber and perhaps also Prime Minister Modi. We're not sure yet, but Claudio's photographs will be on display there, which is a great honor.
Thank you.
If I could just add one small thing, there's a city in Turkey, I think it's in Cappadocia, which can house up to 20,000 people, which is entirely subterranean, that I just learned about.
Yeah.
Please.
Hi. How you doing, Claudio? I have a cultural question for you. So, first of all, how were you received when you went to these communities? I'm curious how the local community also thinks about the wells at this point, and also if they think of them as female.
So the wells are largely for being, mostly abandoned. They're kind of no man's land, or they're available to anybody. I think the only territorial episodes involved monkeys. We had to negotiate with them, and cobras. Not my favorite.
Did you see cobras?
Yeah, a couple times. Yeah. Well, the first time was quite lovely. I was about to go in the well, and the farmer said, "No, that well belongs to Cobra, and he's in there, and so you don't." And right then, I was like, "Yep, fine, it's yours." So otherwise, and then some of them, there are wells where the Archaeological Survey of India had gone in at one point and created signage and whatnot. So it has some nominal status as a tourist attraction, so that they would know why it was that I was there. I think people overall were curious that I was curious about them. And one of the things that I did notice was that I would go into the well, and people would follow me into the well for a little bit, and then they would sort of stop, and they would just stay at the top level, and then I would kind of go down and explore a bit more. And I thought that was kind of interesting that they didn't really want to go into them. And I think that's, I did say that they're connected and all, but when you do go deep down in the well, it can start to feel a little spooky, especially because they're abandoned. You don't know what you're going to find. As far as whether the residents think of the wells as female, most of the wells in Gujarat are named for female deities. So I would guess yes, but I didn't really have conversations with them to know that. But by and large, people were I think they were happy that I was there, and I went out of my way to tell people that I thought it was absolutely lovely, and the well could have been in absolutely decrepit state, and it didn't matter because the original beauty of the place still shone through, and so there was always, sometimes there would be a locked gate, and they said, no, we'll get somebody, and then they, 5 minutes later, the guy would come with this little rusty key and open the gate, and then afterwards they would tell me how happy. Meanwhile, this one well, I went in and it had been colonized by bats, and I'm photographing, and there's this sort of 6 inches of bat guano, and I'm slowly sinking into it and trying to get the picture, and afterwards they're like, "Oh, this is terrible," and I'm washing my face. No, it's fine, it's beautiful. Like, you sure? Like, yes, it's beautiful, and I did mean it. It was gorgeous. So the reception was positive.
Any other questions for Claudio?
Is Eric over there?
Yeah. So I'm going to approach this from a photographic side because obviously that's your medium, and really impressed with the beauty of the structures and how you have documented them. It's been really impressive. So I'm not sure I have as much of a question as your curiosity and how you have documented these. Are other people, when you're there and documenting, how do they approach you as somebody who's documenting this project? And what are you thinking about when you're photographing? Because I think, there is this important aspect of what they function as, but your medium is through photography, and that's how you're sharing this with us.
Yeah. So the first part of the question was about other people who have documented the wells?
It was more about how's the community responding to your being there and documenting the wells, and the other is just more about how are you thinking about this project as a photographer.
Yeah. So as I was just in responding to Carl, I really this project in general was my friend. It's not true of all the projects I do. Some take their pound of flesh, and one of the lovely things was I did it in conjunction with other people, architects in Ahmedabad, who I didn't know where to find them to begin with, and they took me around and showed them to me. Yeah, as I said, generally people were pretty thrilled, and they have some sense that even though they may perceive it as technologically obsolete, that it's beautiful and that it's an important part of their heritage. And so if someone's there, enthusiastically saying how great it is, and I walk out with a big smile on my face, that I seem to think that people are happy about it. Now, as to what I was after when I was documenting, so I was not. I should say that there's been a lot of work on stepwells. There's about a 50-year tradition of scholarship. A lot of it's in English, and some of it is also in Hindi and Gujarati. What I was concerned with was that a lot of the photographic documentation I saw was illustrative in nature. It was trying to show what the wells looked like, and I'm oversimplifying, but what I was after was not so much to catalog and say, okay, these are the various types, this is how many wells there are, this is the most important well, and it was more just to give a sense of what it feels like to be inside the wells, and what are these ambiances that they suggest, which is a highly subjective thing, and it was what I was specifically interested in. So these are. These wells are representative. My selection is maybe representative in some general way of the kinds of wells that you see, but it's representative mainly of my preferences. So one of the things that is I was probably more a fan of circles than I was of straight lines. So there's a lot of circular wells in my selection, and there were some challenges to photographing in a space that. If I'll just get back to a picture of a vav. So like this one, for example, you walk in and you're made to look at the end of the well, which incidentally very often there would be some niche with a statue in the well. So it's narrow. It's a forced perspective. So you go to the well, and very often I would take the same picture every time, and then okay, how do I avoid that kind of forced perspective? But I guess it was just figuring out how could I get something about the well that communicated some sense of the whole? And I guess the word that comes to mind is ambiance. What does it sort of feel like to be in this space? Which is, again, it's a little bit about geometry, but it is about perception of space. So.
Okay.
You mentioned that there's a broad literature on the wells, and I was curious if there's a scientific part of that literature that's trying to use them as a proxy for past hydrological cycle. For instance, you might think that you have to dig deeper when there's lots of water stress and arid era versus the wells aren't as deep when the hydrological cycle's in a different phase. So I was curious if that was part of what you'd come across.
I think most of the people who have written about stepwells have been, in addition to visual artists, historians and of architecture and of urban development. I don't know how, let's say, many hydrologists or geologists have been involved. I was talking with Snehal Shah, who is compiling this magnum opus. Everybody's egging him on to publish it because it's at 5 volumes, and he's been working on it for 30 years. But he talked to me for a long time. He said, "This is something that we can't figure out: is how they knew where to dig the well and how it would be successful, because we've got centuries and centuries of know-how that were retained and passed on orally, and there's really no record of that. So it's interesting, coming at it from a scientific perspective, and analyzing the wells and their depth and their type to see what that says about past, present, future water patterns, for example. It's interesting. That'd be a lovely way to come at them.
I'll take just a couple more over here.
Just a quick question. Did you come across any communities that still have the knowledge of building these wells, or basically architect communities is what I was interested in?
Only through Vishwanath, the community of well diggers that are active in Karnataka, and they dig simple helical wells, that are probably about 6 to 10 meters deep with the staircase going down. There's a development in Jodhpur where the architect actually came to speak.
Yes,
Yeah.
Immersive.
Yeah. So and it's a housing community, and they build a kind of a water canal in the middle of the community, and it incorporates many stepwell motifs, but it's maybe more of a formal echo than a functional one. Well, an example that stayed with me was the ship that I went on to Bangladesh was replaced by a double-hull tanker that was built in the U.S., and it was the first civilian ship that Newport News had built in 30 years. And they had to call engineers out of retirement because they had forgotten how to build the ship. And we have the sense that, knowledge is there, you write it down and you remember it, and this is not true. So the issue of how, if we were to, let's say, dig a stepwell tomorrow, how good a job would we do? How much knowledge is still out there in however fragmentary a fashion, and how much we would be returning to the drawing board and starting over from scratch? I don't really know.
One of those ash.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yes, in the back.
I have a question, maybe just not understanding how water actually makes their way into these wells. Like, you described digging a big hole, but you described it being, groundwater making its way in because you're below the water table. And it seems like the sides are fairly robustly constructed. I mean, is the idea that just at the very base of this well, there's groundwater that's making its way in and then filling through hydraulic head to wherever the water table is, or how does the water get in?
Yeah, it's because you've got this intense burst of rain. You've got the water table is very dynamic in India, and actually, very interestingly, in a lot of these wells, they're not always mortared. In fact, they have sort of they're interlocking stones, which also makes them seismically very stable. So because of that, then the water comes seeping, as the water table rises, it comes seeping through the soil, and then it also comes seeping in and around through the stones.
So it would come in like through these sidewalls here.
Yeah, this guy might be mortared at the top levels, but at the bottom, he probably wasn't. And then there's some measure of rainwater catchment that's happening as well. But it's largely the water table that's coming in and seeping through.
So I think we have a reception outside. So you'll be able to talk to Claudio a little more informally, but please join me in thanking Claudio Cambon.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks to all of you.